I helped a lonely child in first class. I wasn't ready for who his father was. Vespera didn't flinch when the private jet hit a pocket of dead air, but her skin crawled at the rhythmic, subsonic vibration humming through the floor of the first-class cabin. It wasn't turbulence. It was a pressurized frequency used to bypass the vault locks in the aircraft's belly. She leaned over the child in seat 4A, adjusting his headset, and whispered the exact altitude trigger sequence currently arming the cabin's oxygen suppression system. Kalen Vance, a man who moved empires across borders, realized in that heartbeat that his flying fortress had become a pressurized coffin. The quiet woman serving his vintage wine wasn't just a flight attendant. She was the black box specialist who had designed the very acoustic signature security he had stolen. High above the Atlas Mountains, Vespera Belrose serves the elite to hide from the industrial sabotage charges that ruined her career. When she realizes her employer, the notorious Kalen Vance, is being targeted by a sonic bleed attack that she herself pioneered, she has to choose between letting him crash or saving the child caught in the crossfire. As the cabin pressure drops and the plane begins a controlled descent into a hostile desert, Vespera must use her knowledge of aeronautical linguistics to talk the plane, and the man she should hate, out of the sky. The G550 cut through the thin, frigid air at 40,000 feet, a silver needle stitching its way across the Moroccan sky. Inside the first-class cabin, the atmosphere was a curated masterpiece of silence and scent, sandalwood, expensive leather, and the faint, metallic tang of recycled oxygen. To the world, Vespera Belrose was just another nameless face in a crisp navy uniform, a ghost moving through the cabin with a tray of crystal flutes. But Vespera wasn't listening to the soft purr of the Rolls-Royce engines. She was listening to the floor. Her ears, trained by years of recovering black boxes from the twisted wreckage of downed airliners, caught a vibration that shouldn't have existed. It wasn't the erratic shudder of turbulence or the steady thrum of the hydraulic pumps. It was a rhythmic, pulsing hum, a digital ping vibrating at 16 hertz, just below the threshold of human hearing. It was a subsonic handshake. Someone was trying to talk to the plane, and the plane was starting to answer. "More vintage 88, Mr. Vance," Vespera asked, her voice a low, melodic silk that masked the sudden hammering of her heart. Kalen Vance didn't look up from his tablet. The sky merchant was a man of sharp angles and even sharper silences. His tailored suit was the color of a desert storm, and his eyes, when he finally raised them, were as cold as the altitude outside. To his right, a young boy no older than 7, Kalen's son, Julian, was slumped against the window, his noise-canceling headphones glowing with a soft amber light. "You're late with the service, Belrose," Kalen remarked, his voice a gravelly baritone. "Efficiency is the only reason I haven't replaced this crew with synthetics." "My apologies, sir," Vespera said, leaning down as if to adjust the linen napkin on his tray. As she moved, her hand brushed the cold metal of the armrest, feeling the pulse again. It was faster now. A countdown. "But I wouldn't worry about the service. I'd worry about the sonic bleed currently echoing through your flight control actuators." Kalen's thumb froze over the screen. He turned his head slowly, his gaze pinning her like a specimen under glass. "Explain yourself, quickly." "That vibration in the floorboards isn't the wind," Vespera whispered, her voice dropping into the clinical, terrifyingly calm register of a black box specialist. "It's a phased array acoustic override. Someone is using a localized ground station to slave your fly-by-wire system to an external pilot. In approximately 60 seconds, they'll trigger the altitude sensors to think the plane is overspeeding. The nose will pitch down, and the cockpit door, your invincible titanium seal, will magnetically lock from the outside." Kalen sneered, though a flicker of doubt crossed his face. "This aircraft has the highest encryption in the Gilded Weaver's fleet. My engineers designed this specifically to be unhackable." "Your engineers used the Aura encryption backbone," Vespera countered, her eyes reflecting the dim cabin lights. "I know, because I'm the one who wrote the proprietary acoustic handshake they stole to build it. And right now, someone is using my own backdoor to turn this cabin into a pressurized coffin." As if on cue, the cabin lights flickered and died. A deep, mechanical clunk echoed from the belly of the plane. The floor tilted forward. The champagne glass on Kalen's tray slid slowly, then violently, shattering against the bulkhead as the nose of the G550 dipped into a steep, uncommanded dive. "Julian!" Kalen roared, lunging for his son as the boy was jerked against his seatbelt. The emergency red lights pulsed to life, bathing the cabin in a bloody, rhythmic glow. The high-pitched whine of the engines increased to a scream as the aircraft began to plummet toward the jagged peaks of the Atlas Mountains below. "The cockpit!" Kalen shouted, scrambling toward the front of the plane, his hand reaching for the heavy security door. "Don't!" Vespera screamed, catching his arm. "The magnets are already charged. If you touch that handle, the static discharge will fuse the locks permanently. They've muted the sensors, Kalen. The pilots don't even know the plane is diving. They think they're still in level flight." Kalen grabbed her by the collar, his face inches from hers, the roar of the rushing air outside beginning to fill the cabin as the pressure began to fluctuate. "If you built this, you know how to stop it. Fix it, or I'll throw you out of the airlock myself." Vespera didn't flinch. She reached into the service galley, tearing away the plastic molding of the intercom station to reveal a mass of fiber-optic cables. "I can't stop the dive from here. They've bypassed the main bus." "Then what are you doing?" Kalen demanded. Vespera pulled a small, jagged piece of metal from her pocket, a shard of a recovered black box she kept as a lucky charm. She jammed it into the center of the cable cluster, sparks showering her face. "I'm not stopping the plane," she said, her voice trembling with a raw, tactical urgency. "I'm blinding the hijackers. If they can't see our telemetry, they can't refine the crash angle." The plane lurched violently to the left, a sickening groan of metal echoing through the airframe. Julian began to cry, the pressure change making his ears pop painfully. Outside the window, the moonlit desert was rushing up to meet them at 500 miles per hour. "The oxygen masks," Kalen yelled, reaching for the overhead compartments. "They won't drop," Vespera shouted over the deafening roar of the wind. "They've slaved the atmospheric controls to the landing gear. They aren't trying to crash us yet, Kalen. They're trying to knock us out first." As she spoke, a thick, white mist began to hiss from the floor vents. It wasn't smoke. It was pure nitrogen, designed to displace the oxygen in the cabin and send everyone into a permanent sleep before the plane ever hit the ground. Vespera looked at Kalen, then at the terrified child. Her hands were steady, even as the world turned upside down. "We have to go to the cargo hold. Now. It's the only part of the plane with a manual atmospheric override." "And if we can't get there?" Kalen asked, his breath already coming in short, panicked gasps. "Then we'll be the first people in history to die of suffocation at 40,000 feet while moving at Mach 0.8, Vespera replied. Suddenly, a massive, dull thud shook the tail of the plane. A sinister, high-pitched whistling sound filled the cabin. Vespera's eyes widened as she looked at the pressure gauge on her wrist. They just blew the rear pressure seal. The plane isn't just diving anymore. She looked at the window as the glass began to frost over with crystalline speed. "It's disintegrating." The scream of the wind tearing through the fuselage was a jagged, high-frequency blade. The G550, once a pinnacle of aerodynamic grace, was now a dying bird falling from the night sky. Inside the cabin, the red emergency lights pulsed with the rhythm of a failing heart, illuminating the thick white nitrogen mist that was curling across the floor like a predatory snake. Kalen Vance stood in the center of the tilting aisle, his knuckles white as he braced himself against a carbon fiber seatback. The sky merchant was used to being the one pulling the strings, the one who controlled the gravity of every room he entered. But here, at 30,000 feet and dropping, he was just another body subject to the laws of physics. "Julian, stay in the seat, keep the mask on." Kalen roared, his voice cracking as the air pressure continued to drop. Vespera was already moving, her uniform jacket discarded, revealing a mesh tactical harness she had hidden beneath her server's vest. She wasn't just a flight attendant anymore. She moved with the mechanical, cold efficiency of someone who had spent her life inside the skeletons of crashed planes. "The cockpit door is fused," Kalen shouted, slamming his shoulder against the titanium barrier. "If the pilots are alive, they can't hear me. We're going to hit the ridge in 3 minutes." "They can't hear you because they're in a digital loop," Vespera screamed back, her fingers tearing at a recessed panel near the galley floor. "The aura backbone I wrote has a sensory masking protocol. Their instruments are showing them a clear horizon and level flight. To them, we're still cruising at 40,000 feet. They won't know we're crashing until the moment of impact." Kalen turned, his eyes wide with a mix of fury and realization. "You didn't just write the encryption, Belrose. You built the silence." "I built it for the military to hide from radar, not for you to smuggle artifacts," Vespera snapped. She ripped the panel away, revealing the aircraft's secondary flight data recorder, the black box. She didn't try to pull it out. Instead, she produced a handheld diagnostic tool, a salvaged piece of tech that looked like a jagged, glass-covered brick. She slammed it into the recorder's interface. "What are you doing?" Kalen demanded, stumbling as the plane took another sickening lurch to the right. "I'm ghosting the signal." Vespera's hands were a blur of motion. "The hijackers are slave to our telemetry. They see what the plane sees. If I can feed a recursive loop back into the stream, I can mute our descent in their feed. They'll think we've leveled off, even as we drop. It buys us time to reach the cargo hold." "We don't have time." Kalen lunged toward her, grabbing her by the collar of her harness. "My sun is turning blue, Vespera. The oxygen is gone." Vespera looked at Julian. The boy's eyes were fluttering, his small hands clutching the armrests. The nitrogen displacement was working faster than she had calculated. "The cargo hold has a dedicated air scrubber for the live animal transports," Vespera said, her voice dropping into that terrifyingly calm, tactical register. "It's a manual system. It doesn't run on the digital bus. If we can get through the floor hatch, we can breathe." "Then get it open," Kalen yelled. Vespera looked at the diagnostic tool. The progress bar was hovering at 88%. "If I leave this now, the loop breaks. The hijackers will see the crash angle and correct the flight surfaces to make sure we hit the granite. I have to stay here until the handshake is complete." "I'll open the hatch," Kalen said, his voice regaining some of its gravelly authority. He knelt by the service hatch in the center of the cabin, his fingers clawing at the recessed manual release. "Give me the override code." "It's not a code, Kalen. It's a physical tension lock. You have to pull the lever and the safety pin at the exact same time, or the pressure differential will shear the bolts." Kalen gripped the lever. His muscles bulged under his suit jacket, the fabric straining as he fought against the massive suction of the depressurizing cabin. "Julian, hold on." A violent jolt rocked the plane. A sound like a gunshot echoed through the cabin. The rear pressure seal had finally failed completely. Debris began to fly toward the back of the aircraft. Crystal glasses, silk pillows, and Kalen's leather briefcase were sucked into the dark, whistling void of the tail section. "The handshake is done," Vespera screamed, ripping the diagnostic tool free. She lunged toward the hatch just as Kalen heaved the lever upward. The hatch didn't just open, it exploded. The pressure differential slammed Vespera against the ceiling, her breath forced out of her lungs in a cold, agonizing rush. Below them, the cargo hold was a cavern of shadows, lit only by the flickering strobes of the landing gear bay. "Julian, go!" Kalen shoved the boy through the hatch into the arms of the cargo netting below. As Vespera dropped down after the boy, she looked up at Kalen, who was still hanging onto the edge of the cabin floor. Behind him, through the cockpit's glass partition, she saw something that made her blood turn to ice. The cockpit door wasn't just locked, it was glowing red. "Kalen, move," she screamed. A high-pitched, electronic pulse rippled through the air. The aura system, sensing the digital ghost she had planted, had initiated an emergency purge. The white nitrogen mist in the cabin didn't just dissipate, it ignited. A flash of blue fire swept across the ceiling of the first-class cabin. Kalen dangled from the hatch, the flames licking at his heels, as the plane's internal systems began to melt into a molten slag. But that wasn't the worst part. As the cargo hold lights flickered on, Vespera turned around. Sitting in the center of the hold, surrounded by crates of stolen artifacts, was a massive metallic cylinder. It was vibrating with the same subsonic hum as the floorboards. It wasn't a cargo container. It was a remote access server. "They aren't just hijacking the plane from the ground, Kaylin," Vespera whispered, her face pale in the strobe light. "The hijackers are already on board. They're in the box." And the box was starting to open. The cargo hold was a world of violent shadows and freezing drafts. The G550 groaned as it leveled out slightly, but the relief was a lie. The aircraft was bleeding altitude at a rate that made the inner ear scream. Above them, through the open service hatch, the first-class cabin was a furnace of blue nitrogen fire, the crackle of melting carbon fiber echoing like small arms fire. Vespera tumbled into the cargo netting, her lungs burning as she gasped for the thin, icy air. Beside her, Julian was curled in a ball, his small chest heaving. The boy wasn't crying anymore. He was past that, drifting into the lethargic fog of hypoxia. "Julian, look at me," Vespera shouted, crawling toward him. She grabbed a portable oxygen canister from the emergency locker and pressed the mask to his face. "Breathe. Deep breaths, Julian." Kaylin dropped down a second later, hitting the floor with a heavy thud. He looked back up at the hatch, his face smeared with soot, his expensive suit jacket scorched. "The cabin is gone," he rasped, his voice sounding thin in the low-pressure environment. "The nitrogen ignition fused the upper deck. We're trapped down here." Vespera didn't answer. She was staring at the center of the hold. The metallic cylinder she had noticed earlier wasn't just a server, it was a parasite. It had been bolted directly into the plane's primary data bus, its cooling fans whining as it processed the hijacked telemetry. "Kaylin, get back from that thing," Vespera warned, shielding Julian with her body. "What is it? A bomb?" Kaylin reached for his waistband, pulling a compact, high-caliber pistol. "Worse, it's a localized relay," Vespera said, her mind racing through the schematics of the Aura system. "It's not just slaving the flight controls, it's broadcasting a quiet zone around the plane. It's why no one has intercepted us. To the Moroccan air defense, this patch of sky is empty." The plane took another sickening lurch. Outside the small, reinforced portholes of the hold, the jagged, moonlit teeth of the Atlas Mountains were no longer distant. They were rising, cutting through the clouds like prehistoric predators. "The air," Kaylin gasped, clutching his chest. "Vespera, the scrubber, you said there was a manual override." Vespera lunged for the rear bulkhead, tearing away a padded insulation panel to reveal a rusted iron wheel, the legacy manual backup for the animal transport bins. She grabbed the handle and heaved. It didn't budge. "It's frozen," she screamed. "The condensation from the pressure drop. It's iced the valve shut." Kaylin stumbled toward her, his movements sluggish. He shoved her aside, grabbing the wheel with both hands. His muscles strained, the veins in his neck bulging as he fought the frozen iron. "I didn't build an empire to die in a cellar," he growled through gritted teeth. With a shriek of protesting metal, the wheel turned. A hiss of stale, warm air flooded the hold. It wasn't mountain fresh, but it was rich with life-saving oxygen. They slumped against the crates, gasping, as the fog in their brains began to lift. But the silence that followed was even more terrifying. The high-pitched whine of the engines had changed to a low, rhythmic pulsing. "They're slowing us down," Vespera whispered, her eyes fixed on the vibrating server. "They don't want to crash us anymore. They want to land us." "Land us where?" Kaylin asked, checking his weapon. "We're in the middle of a mountain range." "There." Vespera pointed out the porthole. Below them, tucked into a high-altitude plateau, was a flickering line of amber lights. It wasn't an airport. It was a makeshift runway cut into a salt flat, surrounded by the skeletal remains of ancient ruins. "The Gilded Weaver's dead zone outpost," Kaylin hissed, his eyes narrowing. "They're bringing the Sky Merchant home for an audit." "We can't land," Vespera said, her voice trembling. Kaylin, if that plane touches the ground, the server will trigger a hard erase of the black box. Every piece of evidence of what they've done and every record of who I really am will be vaporized. I'll be a ghost again and you'll be a corpse. Then we jump, Kaylin said, looking at the emergency egress door at the rear of the hold. At this speed, in this terrain, Vespera looked at Julian, who was finally color returning to his cheeks. He won't survive the impact. Suddenly, the metallic cylinder in the center of the room let out a sharp, electronic chirp. A small holographic display projected into the dusty air of the hold. It wasn't a map or a countdown. It was a live video feed. Vespera froze. The screen showed a dimly lit room. A young man was strapped to a chair, his head encased in a complex neural interface helmet. It was her brother, Leo. A small green light on the side of his temple was pulsing in perfect synchronization with the plane's engine vibrations. Leo, Vespera breathed, her hand pressing against the cold metal of the server. A voice, distorted and cold, echoed through the hold's intercom. Adjust your descent, architect. Your brother's neural pathways are currently slave to the aircraft's landing gear. If the touchdown is anything less than perfect, the feedback loop will shatter his frontal lobe. Vespera looked at the mountain plateau rushing up to meet them. She looked at Kaylin, whose son was huddled in the corner. Then she looked at the server that held her brother's life in a digital vice. The plane's landing gear cycled down with a heavy, mechanical clunk. Vespera, what are they doing? Kaylin demanded, seeing the look of pure agony on her face. They aren't just using the plane to catch you, Kaylin, Vespera whispered, a single tear tracking through the soot on her cheek. They're using my brother as the landing computer. Outside, the salt flat rushed toward them, but as the wheels touched the ground, the plane didn't decelerate. It sped up. The brakes, Kaylin yelled. Why aren't we stopping? Vespera looked at the screen. Leo's heart rate was skyrocketing. They aren't landing, Vespera realized, her horror deepening. They're using the runway to calibrate his brain. They're going to take off again with us trapped inside a bomb. Chapter 4, The Oxygen Debt. The wheels of the G550 shrieked as they kissed the sun-baked salt of the plateau, but there was no deceleration. The aircraft groaned, its structural frame vibrating with a violent, unnatural frequency as it tore across the makeshift runway at 200 knots. Outside the cargo portholes, the amber lights of the Weaver's outpost blurred into long, predatory streaks. They're not stopping, Kaylin roared, bracing his weight against a titanium shipping crate. Vespera, the runway ends in 1,000 meters. There's nothing but a vertical drop into the canyon after that. Vespera didn't look at the window. Her eyes were locked on the holographic feed of her brother. Leo's face was contorted in a silent scream. His eyes rolled back as the neural interface helmet pulsed a frantic, overheating red. The plane's sensors were feeding the raw data of the high-speed taxi directly into his cerebral cortex, using his neurons as a biological processor to calculate the ground effect turbulence. They're using the friction, Vespera shouted, her voice trembling. The heat from the tires is being converted into a kinetic burst to jumpstart the secondary turbines. They're going to vault us back into the air before we can even breathe. As she spoke, the overhead vents in the cargo hold let out a final, dying wheeze. The manual scrubber wheels she and Kaylin had fought to turn suddenly spun backward, locked by a remote command. The hiss of fresh air stopped. The atmospheric gauge on Vespera's wrist began to tick down with terrifying speed. O2, 12%, 11%. The air is gone, Kaylin gasped, dropping his pistol as his fingers lost their grip. He slumped against a crate, his face turning a waxy, translucent gray. Beside him, Julian's eyes were drifting shut, his small hands going limp in the cargo netting. Vespera, do something. Vespera felt the edges of her vision begin to blacken. The hypoxia was a cold, heavy blanket settling over her mind. She looked around the hold, her eyes landing on a massive, obsidian-black crate in the corner, marked with the Gilded Weaver's highest-level security seal, Stigma 7. The artifact, she whispered, her voice a dry rasp. Kaylin, the manifest, what was in the black crate? Kalen blinked, his thoughts moving through molasses. The Aeolian lyre, an atmospheric resonator, stolen from the ruins in Sigil Massa, my men said. It sings when the pressure drops. Vespera's black box training kicked in, not the mechanics of flight, but the science of acoustics. She knew that ancient artifacts made of porous limestone and piezoelectric quartz could, under the right ultrasonic frequency, stimulate a chemical reaction in trapped mineral pockets. It doesn't just sing, Vespera realized, crawling toward the crate. It's a photosynthetic catalyst. If I can vibrate the quartz at the right pitch, it will release the concentrated oxygen byproduct stored in its mineral core. You want to talk to a rock. For air, Kalen wheezed, his head lolling back. I'm not talking to it, Vespera said, her fingers fumbling with the crate's biometric lock. I'm going to scream at it. She didn't have the key, and the electronic override was dead. She grabbed a heavy steel wrench from the floor and slammed it against the crate's latch, over and over, until her knuckles bled. The latch shattered. She threw the lid open, revealing a jagged, hollowed-out stone pillar etched with impossible geometric patterns. The plane roared, the nose pitching upward. They were at the edge of the plateau. The engines screamed as they transitioned from ground run to vertical climb. The G-force slammed Vespera into the stone. Vespera, Kalen's voice was almost gone. She leaned her face into the hollow of the stone. She didn't have a speaker or a resonator. She had only her voice, the voice that had decoded 1,000 black boxes. She took the last of the air in her lungs and hummed a sharp, piercing 432 hertz tone directly into the artifact's internal chamber. At first, there was nothing. Then, the stone began to glow with a faint, bioluminescent green. A low, haunting melody echoed from the rock, vibrating against her cheekbones. A rush of cold, sweet, ozone-rich air erupted from the pillar, hitting her face like a physical blow. Kalen, Julian, get over here, she screamed, her voice returning as the oxygen hit her bloodstream. She dragged the half-conscious boy toward the stone, pressing his face into the glowing mist. Kalen followed, gasping as he inhaled the ancient, mineral-rich air. For a moment, the three of them huddled around the singing rock, breathing in the secret of a dead civilization while the modern world shrieked around them. But the relief was shattered by the server in the center of the room. The holographic display of her brother flickered. Leo was bleeding from his nose now. The feedback loop was reaching its limit. Calibration complete, the distorted voice announced over the intercom. Targeting sequence engaged. The architect has provided the air, now the sky merchant will provide the target. The floor of the cargo hold groaned as the external bay doors began to cycle open. Not the emergency exit, but the heavy bombing bay beneath the floorboards. Vespera looked through the widening gap. Below them, the salt flat was receding, replaced by the sprawling, lit-up grid of a massive city. Casablanca, Kalen whispered, staring at the lights. They're not just flying us, we're over the most populated center in Morocco. And the server, Vespera realized, looking at the vibrating cylinder. It's not just a relay anymore. Kalen, look at the cooling vents. The server was glowing with an intense, pulsing ultraviolet light. It wasn't just processing data, it was concentrating an acoustic charge. They weren't in a plane anymore. They were inside a sonic bomb, and the Weaver's outpost hadn't been a landing strip. It was a launch pad. We have to dump the server, Kalen shouted, reaching for the release lever. If you dump it, it detonates over the city, Vespera screamed, grabbing his arm. And if it detonates, the feedback will kill Leo instantly. Suddenly, the plane took a violent 90-degree bank. A sleek black interceptor jet pulled up alongside their wing, its pilot visible through the canopy. The interceptor didn't fire. It matched their speed, and a robotic arm extended from its fuselage, clamping onto their wingtip. A screen on the server flickered to life. It wasn't the Weaver. It was a woman with cold, silver hair and eyes that matched Vespera's own. "Hello, Vespera," the woman said. "It's been a long time since we shared a flight. Did you really think I'd let you keep my son's mind all to yourself?" Vespera's breath hitched. "Mother." the interceptor jet began to bank sharply, dragging the G550 toward a massive, dark cloud bank over the ocean. "The server is armed, Vespera," her mother said, her voice a calm, maternal poison. "Either you give me the Sky Merchant's ledger, or I'll watch your brother's mind burn while you fall into the Atlantic." The air in the cargo hold was a thick, cloying mixture of ancient ozone from the singing artifact and the sharp, chemical tang of the server's overheating circuits. Outside, the world was a blur of gray-black mist as the interceptor jet dragged the G550 toward the Atlantic. The holographic face of Alara Belrose, Vespera's mother, flickered with a cold, spectral light, her expression devoid of any maternal warmth. "Vespera, you were always the sentimental one," Alara said, her voice cutting through the roar of the wind. "Your father was the same. He thought he could keep the aura code for himself, as if genius isn't meant to be shared. Now, look at Leo. He's the bridge between the machine and the target. Don't let his mind unravel just because you're too stubborn to hand over Kalen's ledger." Kalen Vance stood tall, despite the staggering lurch of the aircraft. His fingers were white where he gripped a support pillar, his gaze shifting between the screen and the boy huddled in the cargo netting. "The ledger isn't just a list of names, Vespera," Kalen hissed. "It's the encryption keys to every shipping lane in the Weaver's network. If she gets it, the Gilded Weaver isn't just a syndicate anymore. It becomes a god of the sky." "My brother is dying, Kalen," Vespera screamed, her voice cracking as she watched a fresh trickle of blood run from Leo's ear on the monitor. "I don't care about your empire." She lunged for the server, her fingers flying across the auxiliary keypad. She wasn't trying to send the ledger. She was trying to desynchronize the neural link. But the server let out a sharp, electronic bark, and a bolt of static electricity threw her back against a crate of stolen marble statues. "The link is biometric, Vespera," Alara said softly. "It only breaks when the target is neutralized, or when the mission is complete." Suddenly, a violent shudder rocked the plane. A siren began to wail from the tails section, a deep, mournful howl that signaled a catastrophic failure in the rear hydraulic bay. "The pressure seal," Kalen yelled. "The tail is tearing off." Vespera scrambled to her feet, her eyes darting to the service monitor. Through a secondary camera, she saw Malik, the young flight engineer who had been caught in the depressurization of the upper deck. He was clinging to a hydraulic line in the tail section, his body half suspended over the open sky as the fuselage groaned and began to peel away like an orange rind. "He's still alive," Vespera whispered, her heart hammering against her ribs. "Vespera, stay focused," Kalen barked, grabbing her arm. "We have to reach the server's core. If we don't dump the acoustic charge now, the bomb will prime itself. We have 40 seconds. If I don't go back there and seal that bulkhead, Malik will be sucked out," Vespera said, her eyes wide with a frantic, moral agony. "If you go back there, you won't have time to stop the signal to your brother," Kalen countered, his face inches from hers. "The Weaver's toll, Vespera. You sacrifice the piece to save the board. That's how the world works." Vespera looked at the screen. Leo's eyes were rolling back into his head, his brain struggling to process the chaotic data of the plane's disintegration. Then she looked at the monitor of Malik, whose eyes were fixed on the camera, wide with a silent, parochial terror as the metal beneath him screamed. "Not today," Vespera hissed. She wrenched her arm free and sprinted toward the rear of the hold. The wind was a solid wall of ice, pushing against her as she fought toward the manual bulkhead lever. The tail section was vibrating so violently that the rivets were popping out like bullets. She reached the lever just as a massive section of the tail housing sheared off, revealing the dark, churning Atlantic 2,000 feet below. Malik's fingers were slipping. "Give me your hand," Vespera roared over the deafening gale. She leaned out over the abyss, her fingers brushing Malik's cold, grease-stained skin. With a primal scream of effort, she hauled him inward, his weight nearly dragging her out with him. Just as his boots cleared the seal, she slammed the manual lever down. The heavy steel bulkhead crashed shut, sealing the hold, but the force of the lock shattered her own wrist. She collapsed to the floor, clutching her arm as Malik gasped for air beside her. But the victory was hollow. Vespera! Kaylin's voice was a frantic roar from the front of the hold. She looked up. The server's holographic display had turned a solid, blinding crimson. The timer! Vespera gasped, the pain in her arm blurring her vision. The 40 seconds were gone. The sonic bomb didn't detonate, it did something far worse. It stabilized. The G550 suddenly stopped vibrating. The silence was absolute, more terrifying than any roar. The interceptor jet released its clamp, banking away into the clouds. "Why did they let us go?" Kaylin whispered, looking out the porthole. Vespera looked at the server. The quiet zone had expanded. They weren't being dragged anymore. They were drifting. "They didn't let us go," Vespera said, her voice trembling as she looked at the radar. The G550's navigation system had been completely wiped. In its place, a single coordinate appeared on the screen. It wasn't a city. It wasn't a runway. It was a point in the middle of the ocean where the water was 6 miles deep. And on the monitor, Leo had stopped screaming. He was staring directly into the camera, his eyes glowing with the same ultraviolet light as the server. "The toll has been paid, Vespera," Leo's voice came through the speakers, but it wasn't his voice. It was a synthesized harmony of 1,000 digital whispers. "The pilot has arrived, and he wants to go home." The plane suddenly banked into a vertical, supersonic dive, straight toward the black heart of the Atlantic. The sky has turned into a prison, and the only way out is down. Vespera saved a life, but in the cold math of the Gilded Weaver, did she just trade her brother's soul for a few heartbeats of mercy? The descent has begun, and the water is rising to meet them. If your heart is racing as fast as Vespera's right now, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe so you're on board when the truth finally surfaces. What do you think the golden anchor actually is? Drop your theories in the COMMENTS. I read every single one, and your predictions might just be the key to the next twist. Thanks for watching, and stay strapped in. The vertical dive was a physical assault. The G550 plummeted toward the churning Atlantic, the air inside the cargo hold screaming as the structural frame pushed past its Mach limits. Vespera gripped the support pillar with her good hand, her shattered wrist throbbing in a rhythm of white-hot agony. Beside her, Malik was still gasping for air, his eyes wide as he watched the altimeter on the bulkhead spin downward like a frantic clock. "He's taking us into the water," Kaylin yelled, his voice strained against the G-force. "Vespera, pull him out of it, break the link." Vespera looked at the monitor. Leo's face was no longer human. His skin was pale, his pupils blown wide, reflecting the ultraviolet binary code of the aura system. He wasn't her brother anymore. He was a terminal. "I can't break it from here," Vespera screamed. "The interceptor jet didn't just release us, it uploaded a parasitic navigation loop. We're slaved to a dead reckoning point." Just as the gray expanse of the ocean seemed ready to swallow them, the engines roared with a violent, upward thrust. The plane leveled off so sharply that the rivets in the floorboards groaned. But they weren't over the Atlantic anymore. The aura system had used a localized gravity well trick, a holographic displacement Vespera had designed years ago to fool radar. They hadn't been flying toward the sea. They had been flying into a low-altitude thermal pocket over the desert. The G550 slammed onto a flat, desolate expanse of white salt, the deep interior of the Moroccan Sahara. The landing gear shattered upon impact, and the aircraft skidded for nearly a mile, kicking up a rooster tail of salt and dust that blotted out the stars. When the motion finally stopped, the silence was more violent than the crash. "Julian, Julian!" Kaylin scrambled through the debris, hauling his son out from beneath a fallen crate of artifacts. The boy was shivering, his face covered in a fine layer of white salt, but he was breathing. Vespera pushed herself up, her vision swimming. She crawled toward the cargo door. The emergency release was jammed. Outside the small, scratched porthole, the world had turned into an opaque wall of swirling orange grit. "A sandstorm," Malik whispered, clutching his chest. "We're grounded in the middle of a haboob." "No," Vespera said, her voice trembling as she pressed her ear to the fuselage. "Listen." It wasn't the erratic whistle of wind. It was a deep, rhythmic thrumming that shook the very ground beneath the plane. Thump, thump, thump. Seismic shaker, rigs, Kalen hissed, his hand going to his pistol. The Weavers ground teams. They're using low-frequency vibration to liquefy the salt flat. They don't need to break in, they're just going to let the desert swallow us whole. The plane is sinking, Malik cried out as the floor tilted at a sickening angle. The heavy nose of the G550 was already disappearing into the shifting, liquefied salt. Vespera lunged for the server. The holographic feed of Leo was still active. He was staring at her, his head tilting in a mechanical, bird-like motion. "The architect is in the box," Leo's synthesized voice whispered. "The Weaver wants the ledger, Vespera. Give it to the sand, or the sand will become your lungs." "Kalen, the ledger," Vespera gasped, the heat in the hold rising as the sand blocked the cooling vents. "If you don't broadcast the decryption keys, they won't stop the shakers. We'll be buried 40 feet deep in 10 minutes. Kalen looked at his son, then at the dark, sinking horizon outside. He reached into his inner pocket and pulled out a small obsidian glass tablet, the heart of his empire. "If I give them this, I'm giving them the world, Vespera. Every ship, every hidden port, every life I've protected. They'll turn the sky into a graveyard. And if you don't, your son dies in a tin can," Vespera shouted, pointing at Julian, who was coughing as the fine dust began to seep through the damaged seals. Kalen's jaw tightened. He looked at the tablet, his thumb hovering over the biometric purge. "There has to be another way. You're the one who designed the aura shroud. Can't you invert the frequency? Make the sand solid again?" "I need a massive power source to override the shakers," Vespera said, her mind racing through the physics of the site. "The singing artifact. If I can resonance link the quartz to the plane's auxiliary power unit, I can create a standing wave that will stabilize the ground for 100 yards. "Do it," Kalen commanded. Vespera grabbed a set of heavy-duty jumper cables from the maintenance locker. She began to strip the wires with her teeth, her breath coming in ragged gasps as the cabin temperature climbed to 100 degrees. She clamped the leads to the glowing limestone pillar of the Aeolian lyre. "Malik, I need you to throttle the APU to maximum. Kalen, hold the cables. Don't let the vibration shake them loose." The moment Malik hit the switch, the artifact didn't just sing, it shrieked. A blinding, emerald light filled the hold. The sound was so intense that Vespera's ears began to bleed, but she didn't stop. She tuned the frequency, matching the subterranean thrum of the Weaver's shaker rigs. Outside, the sinking stopped. The grinding sound of the sand against the hull changed to a glassy chime. For a moment, they were floating on a solid island of crystallized salt in the middle of a shifting sea. "It's working," Malik cheered. But the victory was short-lived. The server in the center of the room let out a low, ominous growl. The holographic image of Leo shifted. He wasn't looking at Vespera anymore. He was looking at something behind her. "The resonance is a beacon, Vespera," Leo's voice said, now sounding terrifyingly clear. "You didn't just stabilize the ground. You gave them a target for the secondary strike." A shadow loomed over the sandstorm. It wasn't a truck. It was a massive, low-flying thermal bombing drone, its belly glowing with a concentrated heat signature. "Kalen, get down," Vespera screamed. The drone didn't fire a missile. It dropped a localized atmospheric collapse charge, a vacuum bomb designed to snuff out the oxygen for a square mile. As the charge detonated, the emerald light of the artifact flickered and died. The air was ripped out of Vespera's lungs, and the floor beneath them turned back into liquid salt with a violent, upward surge. The plane didn't just sink, it rolled. As Vespera slid toward the darkness of the tail section, her hand caught on a loose piece of metal. But it wasn't a piece of the plane. It was a secondary, hidden compartment beneath Kalen's private safe. A physical file fell out, its pages fluttering in the dying light. Vespera grabbed it, her eyes widening as she read the first page. It wasn't a shipping manifest. It was a project report from 12 years ago. Project Recovery, Operation Black Box, Architect, BLROSEM. The signature at the bottom wasn't her mother. It was her father's. And the man who had commissioned the mission that killed him wasn't an anonymous corporate ghost. The signature was Kaylin Vance. Vespera looked up at Kaylin, who was reaching out to pull her from the rising sand. She didn't take his hand. She looked at him with a gaze that was colder than the desert night. "You," she whispered. Before Kaylin could answer, the hull of the G550 gave way. A massive, steel-toothed claw tore through the roof of the cargo hold, and a figure in a high-altitude pressure suit descended through the dust. The figure didn't point a gun at Kaylin. It pointed at Vespera. "Architect," the figure said, the voice muffled by the helmet. "The Weaver is tired of waiting. It's time to go to the vault." The steel claw retracted, leaving a jagged, gaping wound in the roof of the G550. Sand poured in like an hourglass, burying the fine silk carpets and the shattered crystal. The figure in the high-altitude pressure suit landed with a heavy, metallic thud, the visor of their helmet reflecting the emerald pulse of the dying artifact. Vespera stood frozen, the physical file clutched in her good hand. The edges of the paper were singed, but the words were indelible. Project Recovery. Architect. Belrose M. Commissioning Agent. Vance K. The man she had just saved, the man whose child she had protected, was the reason her father's plane had vanished into the Atlantic 12 years ago. "Vespera, listen to me," Kaylin said, his voice a low, desperate rasp. He took a step toward her, his hand outstretched, but he stopped when he saw the raw, glacial fury in her eyes. "It's not what it looks like. The Gilded Weaver." They forced my hand. I was trying to buy him out of the contract, not end him. "You signed the order," Vespera whispered, her voice trembling with a lethal edge. "You knew the black box would be rigged to fail. You sent him into a dead-drop zone and watched him fall from the sky just to protect your shipping routes." "Architect," the suited figure interrupted, their voice synthesized and cold. "The vault is opening. The seismic shift has exposed the primary bulkhead. Move now or stay and be buried with the merchant." The figure didn't wait for an answer. They fired a tether into the rear bulkhead, the cable pulling taut as the plane shifted again. The G550 was now tilted at a 60-degree angle, the nose completely submerged in the liquefied salt. Kaylin lunged for Julian, throwing the boy over his shoulder. "We have to go. Vespera, whatever you think of me, don't let the sand take you." For Julian. Vespera looked at the boy's terrified face, then at the file in her hand. The moral weight of the moment felt heavier than the thousands of tons of sand pressing against the hull. With a snarl of frustration, she shoved the file into her tactical harness and scrambled toward the breach in the roof. They emerged into a nightmare. The sandstorm was an orange wall of screaming grit, lit from beneath by the flickering lights of the Weaver's shaker rigs. But the rigs weren't trucks. They were massive, semi-autonomous pylons driven deep into the earth, vibrating with a frequency that made the very air feel like it was shattering. In the center of the salt flat, a massive obsidian structure was rising. It looked like a tomb from another age, but the hum coming from it was purely digital. This was the forbidden library of the Gilded Weaver, the physical server farm where every deleted secret of the sky was stored in cold, hardened stasis. They aren't just here for the ledger, Vespera realized. Her linguist's mind decoding the rhythmic thrum of the vault's entrance. They're using the plane's crash as a kinetic trigger. The impact wasn't an accident, it was the final key needed to resonate the vault's locks. The suited figure led them toward the obsidian bulkhead. As they approached, the air grew unnaturally still. The sandstorm seemed to curve around the vault, held back by an invisible acoustic shield. The figure reached up and unlatched their helmet. The seal hissed, and as the mask came away, Vespera felt the ground vanish beneath her. It wasn't a mercenary. It was a man who looked exactly like the photo in her file, only aged by 12 years of darkness and salt. "Father," Vespera gasped, the word catching in her throat like a shard of glass. Malachi Belrose didn't smile. His eyes were vacant, fixed on the vault door with a terrifying, singular focus. A neural interface, identical to the one Leo was wearing on the monitor, was fused into the side of his skull. The black box doesn't lie, Vespera, Malachai said, his voice a flat, hollow echo of the man she remembered. It only records, and today it records the end of the Sky Merchant. He's been woven, Kaelin hissed, pulling Julian closer. They didn't kill him, Vespera. They turned him into a living processor. He is the vault's security system. Malachai raised his hand toward the obsidian door. The geometric etchings began to glow with a violent, ultraviolet light. The architect has returned to complete the circuit. Give me the ledger, Kaelin. Give me the keys to the sky, and I will let the children walk. Vespera stepped between them, her heart breaking as she looked at the hollow shell of her father. Dad, look at me. It's Vespera. You taught me how to hear the wind. You told me the sky was the only place where truth couldn't be hidden. Malachai's head tilted, a spark of something human flickering in his eyes for a microsecond before the purple light of the interface flared brighter. Truth is just a frequency, Vespera, and yours is out of tune. He pressed his hand against the door. The obsidian didn't slide. It dissolved into a million microscopic needles of glass, held in place by sound. Inside, the vault was a cathedral of data, filled with rows of glowing obsidian monoliths. But in the very center of the room sat a single, ancient black box, the one from her father's original flight. It was open, and a soft, rhythmic pulsing was coming from within. The golden anchor, Vespera whispered. Suddenly, the seismic rigs outside stopped. The silence was deafening. Every monitor in the vault flickered to life, showing the same image. A dozen Weaver interceptors circling high above the sandstorm, their weapons locked on the vault. They're not letting anyone out, Kaelin realized, his face pale. The Weaver doesn't want the ledger anymore. They want to bury the architect, the merchant, and the evidence in a single grave. Malachai turned to Vespera, his hand twitching. The erasure protocol has begun, Vespera. In 60 seconds, the vault will collapse into the mantle. But there is a secondary handshake, a frequency only you and I know. He pointed to the open black box. The final recording, Malachai said, a single tear of oil-black fluid leaking from his eye. You have to choose, Vespera. Save the man who killed me or save the data that will kill the Weaver. You only have air for one. As he spoke, the obsidian walls began to vibrate. The glass needles that made up the door began to spin like a horizontal hailstorm, sealing them inside. Vespera looked at Kaelin. She looked at her father. Then she looked at the black box. A red light on the box began to blink. It wasn't a recording light. It was a detonator. The obsidian vault was no longer a sanctuary. It was a pressurized chamber of ghosts. The rhythmic blinking of the red light on the ancient black box sat at the center of the room like a pulsing vein, a countdown to a detonation that promised to erase every secret held within these walls. Outside, the seismic rigs had been replaced by the high-pitched whistle of circling drones, their thermal imaging lasers cutting through the dust like needles of light. Vespera stood between two versions of her own destruction. Behind her, Kaelin Vance, the man who had ordered her father's disappearance, clutched his son to his chest, his eyes fixed on the spinning glass needle door. Before her, the hollowed-out remains of her father, Malachai, stood fused to the vault's architecture, his mind a biological relay for the very organization that had stolen his life. Dad, stop the erasure protocol, Vespera pleaded, her voice a fragile rasp. The Weaver is going to level this place with us inside. We can leave. I can get you out of that suit. Malachai's head twitched, a mechanical jerk that sent a spray of black hydraulic fluid from his temple. The circuit must be completed, Vespera. The Weaver doesn't leave loose threads. I am the thread. You are the needle, and the Sky Merchant is the stain. I didn't kill him, Kaelin roared, his voice echoing off the obsidian monoliths. The Gilded Weaver wanted the Aura Code to control the global trade winds. Malachai refused to give them the final seed file. I didn't send him to his death. I hid him. I staged the crash so they wouldn't find him. Vespera whipped around, the singed file trembling in her hand. You hid him in a torture chamber. You turned my father into a server. I lost control of the site years ago, Kaelin countered, his face a mask of desperate sweat. They found the forbidden library and took it from me. I spent a decade trying to find a way back in without triggering the scuttle. That's why I hired you, Vespera. I needed the architect's blood to unlock the back door before they realized I was here. Suddenly, the holographic feed on the vault's central pillar flared to life. It wasn't the Weaver, it was Leo. The boy was no longer staring blankly. His face was contorted in agony, his hands clawing at the neural interface helmet. But he wasn't looking at Vespera. He was looking at Malachi. "Grandfather," Leo's voice whispered through the speakers, a distorted, high-frequency plea. "It hurts the data. It's too hot." Vespera's heart shattered. "Leo, you can hear him." "The neural relay," Vespera realized, her eyes darting between her father and the screen. "They aren't just using Leo to fly the drones. They've bridged his brain to Dad's. They're using the bond between them as a biological signal booster. The more pain Leo feels, the faster the vault processes the erasure." Malachi's body spasmed. The ultraviolet light in his eyes turned a blinding white. "The frequency, it's too high. The boy, he's the anchor. If I don't release the encryption, his mind will liquefy to keep the server cool." The floor beneath them buckled as the first drone strike hit the salt flat above. Dust rained from the ceiling, and the obsidian monoliths began to hum a low, funeral dirge. "The black box," Vespera screamed, lunging for the detonator. "If it's the original flight recorder, it has the master reset. It has the original acoustic signature of my father's voice." She grabbed the jagged, open shell of the box. Inside, the ancient magnetic tape was spinning, glowing with a soft, bioluminescent green, the same light as the singing artifact. "Kaylin, I need the ledger," Vespera demanded, her voice cutting through the roar of the drones. "The physical keys, I have to feed the Weaver's encryption into the box. I can create a feedback loop that will jam the bridge to Leo." Kaylin didn't hesitate. He pulled the obsidian glass tablet from his harness and slammed it into the interface of the black box. "The merchant's life for the architect's son. Do it, Vespera." As the data began to transfer, the vault's temperature spiked. The smell of burning ozone filled the air. Vespera's fingers danced across the black box's manual controls, her linguist's mind translating the Weaver's digital screams into a manageable melody. "Dad, I need you to let go," Vespera cried, her hand reaching for the neural interface on Malachi's temple. "I'm inverting the phase. I'm going to draw the heat into the box." "No," Malachi's voice was suddenly clear, filled with a sudden, terrifying lucidity. "Vespera, the box, it isn't just a detonator, it's a receiver. If you draw the heat in, you become the relay. You'll be the one connected to Leo." "I don't care," Vespera screamed, her thumb hovering over the commit key. But as the progress bar hit 99%, the obsidian doors didn't dissolve. They shattered. The sandstorm rushed in, but it wasn't alone. A dozen Weaver mercenaries in high-altitude suits swarmed the vault, their weapons raised. But they weren't aiming at Kaylin or Vespera. They were aiming at the black box. "Don't let her finish the handshake," a voice boomed from the mercenaries' comms. It was Alara, Vespera's mother. "Destroy the relay. If the data isn't ours, no one gets to keep their mind." A mercenary fired a high-energy pulse. It didn't hit Vespera, it hit Malachi. The old man slumped forward, the violet light in his eyes flickering out. But as he fell, he threw his weight onto the black box, shielding it with his armored suit. "Go," Malachi wheezed, his blood, real red blood, mixing with the hydraulic fluid on the floor. "Vespera, the golden anchor. It's not the data, it's the silence." Vespera grabbed the black box as the vault began to collapse around them. Kaylin grabbed Julian and Malik, diving behind a fallen monolith as the mercenaries opened fire. In the chaos, Vespera looked at the screen. Leo's image was fading, replaced by a single, pulsing coordinate. It wasn't in the desert. It wasn't in the city. It was a point on the ocean floor, 6 miles deep. "The Atlantic," Vespera whispered. "That's where the real server is. The vault is just a shadow." Suddenly, the floor of the vault vanished. The seismic rigs had finally succeeded. The entire obsidian structure dropped into a vertical sinkhole, falling into the dark, hollowed-out mantle of the earth. Vespera felt the weightlessness of the fall, the black box clutched to her chest. As she plummeted into the darkness, she saw her mother's face on the monitor one last time. "See you at the bottom, Vespera," Alara whispered. Then the world went black. The world didn't end with a bang. It ended with the weightless, sickening pull of a vacuum. As the vault collapsed into the sinkhole, Vespera clutched the black box to her chest, her eyes squeezed shut as the roar of shifting salt and snapping obsidian filled her skull. She felt the impact, not against rock, but against something viscous and cold. When she opened her eyes, she wasn't dead. She was floating in a pool of heavy, synthetic coolant at the base of the cavern. Above her, the desert sky was a jagged, distant diamond, partially obscured by the smoke of the burning G550. "Vespera!" Kalen's voice echoed through the dark. He was hauling Julian onto a ledge of reinforced titanium that had survived the fall. Malik was there, too, shivering and covered in white dust, his eyes darting toward the shadows. "I'm here," Vespera rasped, swimming toward the ledge. She shoved the black box onto the metal before climbing up herself. They weren't in a cave. They were standing on the roof of a secondary, pressurized facility, the true heart of the Weaver's terrestrial operations. The obsidian vault above had merely been the skin, a sacrificial layer designed to bury intruders. "The ledger is transmitting," Kalen said, staring at his shattered tablet. "The purge didn't take. When you linked it to the black box, you turned the encryption inside out. My shipping routes, the names of the Weaver's Council. It's all broadcasting on an open frequency." "Then we've won," Malik whispered, a desperate hope in his voice. "No," Vespera said, her gaze fixed on the black box. The bioluminescent green light was fading, replaced by a rhythmic, mournful pulse of amber. "We haven't won. We've just forced them to move to the final phase. The golden anchor isn't a file, Kalen. It's a physical location." She opened the folder she had carried from the plane, the pages now damp with coolant. She pointed to the coordinate her father had left, the one 6 miles deep in the Atlantic. "My father didn't just build the aura code to hide planes," Vespera explained, her voice trembling. "He built a global acoustic dampener. If that coordinate is activated, it won't just mute a jet. It will mute the entire Atlantic floor. Every submarine, every underwater cable, every sonar buoy. The ocean will go silent. The Weaver will be the only ones who can hear in the dark." Suddenly, the red light on the black box stabilized into a steady, burning glow. The holographic display of Leo returned, but the boy was no longer in a room. He was sitting in a high-pressure cockpit, his face obscured by a sleek, liquid oxygen breathing mask. "Leo!" Vespera screamed, slamming her hand against the box. "Architect," the boy's voice came through, but it was layered with the cold, maternal authority of Alara Belrose. "The desert was a diversion. The vault was a test. You have the key, Vespera. Now bring it to the anchor." "Leave him alone," Vespera sobbed. "He is the navigator now," Alara's voice whispered. "He is already at the bottom. If you want to see him again, you have to bring the black box to the trench. But be warned, Vespera. The water doesn't recognize bloodlines. It only recognizes pressure." The screen flickered and died. A low, rhythmic thump began to vibrate through the titanium ledge. It wasn't a shaker rig this time. It was the sound of a heavy-lift helicopter hovering directly over the sinkhole. A high-tension cable descended through the dust, ending in a magnetic grapple. It wasn't there to rescue them. It was there to retrieve the black box. "Vespera, get back!" Kalen shouted, drawing his pistol and firing at the grapple. The bullets sparked harmlessly off the reinforced alloy. "They're taking the key," Malik cried. Vespera looked at the cable, then at the black box, and finally at Kalen. The man who had ruined her life had spent the last hour risking his to save her brother. The power dynamic had shifted. They were no longer the merchant and the servant. They were survivors in a world that had outgrown them both. "Kalen, take Julian and get to the surface," Vespera commanded, her voice turning into a cold, clinical steel. She grabbed a coil of emergency rope from her harness and looped it around the black box, then around her own waist. "What are you doing?" Kaylin demanded, reaching for her. "I'm not letting them have the key without the architect," Vespera said. She looked at him, and for the first time, the hatred in her eyes was tempered by a grim understanding. "If you really want to make up for my father, Kaylin, find the golden anchor. Not for the money, for the sky." She didn't wait for his answer. She lunged for the magnetic grapple as it locked onto the black box. "Vespera, no," Kaylin roared, his hand catching only the air as the cable snapped taut. The helicopter surged upward, reeling in the line. Vespera was jerked off the ledge, dangling over the dark, coolant-filled abyss as she was hauled toward the burning desert sky. As she ascended through the mouth of the sinkhole, she looked down. Kaylin was standing on the ledge, his son tucked under one arm, his other hand raised in a silent, desperate salute. But as the helicopter cleared the canyon walls, Vespera didn't see the Moroccan desert. She saw a fleet of black, unmarked ships waiting on the horizon of the Atlantic, their sonar arrays already pulsing with a deep, guttural frequency. She looked at the black box in her lap. A new message was scrolling across the small LED screen. It wasn't from her mother. It was a pre-recorded message from her father, triggered by the specific pressure of the altitude change. "Property of MALACHAI-BELROSC. If you are reading this, the anchor has been dropped. The only way to stop the silence is to speak the forbidden word." Vespera looked at the horizon, her heart hammering against her ribs. She knew the word. It was the one frequency she had never dared to write into the code. The helicopter banked sharply, heading straight for the lead ship in the fleet. But as the winch began to pull her into the open cargo bay, Vespera saw a figure standing at the edge of the door. It wasn't a mercenary. It was a woman who looked exactly like her. "Welcome to the end of the world, Vespera," her doppelganger said, holding out a hand. "I'm the version of you that didn't miss the flight. The sky was never the limit, it was a lie." Vespera fought the pressure of the deep and the fire of the clouds, only to find that the ultimate betrayal wears her own face. As the golden anchor prepares to drop and silence the world, would you sacrifice your soul to save a family that was never truly yours? If this descent into the Weaver's web left you breathless, hit that like button and subscribe to join us as we chase the truth into the Atlantic trench. What was the most shocking moment for you? The father she found, or the sister she never knew? Let's talk in the COMMENTS. Until the silence breaks. Thanks for watching.